Thank you. Thank you very much. It's very kind of you to come this morning, and thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And so what I have to talk about today comes not just from the 25, 30 years of study, but from some personal experience. What was not in the introduction was some things that I don't usually talk about publicly, which is that I was kicked out of school as a juvenile delinquent, and I spent 1.5 years in a boot camp. When I got out of the boot camp, I went back to public high school and I got kicked out again. And then I went to college, and as a sophomore I got kicked out again for fighting. I was a pretty angry young man. And so what I have to talk about today is try to convince you that happiness is something that you can consciously cultivate. And that you can, modern brain science literally shows us that we can change our brains by how we think about ourselves and how we think about our minds and our hearts. I want to give you some tools. I want to underscore those tools with some of the scientific data that backs them up. But the bottom line, what I'd love is for at least some of you to leave here today saying, you know something, I can consciously decide to be happy. I can consciously, like a work project, I can lay out my objectives. I can lay out the goals, and I have the means by which to get there. And so I'm going to have to start by talking about the brain, because without the brain there's no mind. And so you're going to have to bear with me just a little bit. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the different major parts of the brain. Then we're going to talk about the tonal, this extraordinarily beautiful Native American conceptualization of the human, of the heart, the mind, the body, and the soul. And the notion that these need to be aligned for happiness, that the heart, the mind, and the body and the soul need to be pointed in the same direction. And that a tonal can be attuned with the world and with others, or it cannot be attuned, and you can consciously strive for that attunement. Then we're going to talk about empathy. We're going to talk about compassion. We're going to talk about happiness, joy. We're going to talk about boredom. And we're going to talk about a number of different things that are related to this overall purpose. And then we're going to get to some action steps. So there's a lot to cover today. Let's get started. Let me talk a little bit about the brain. Okay, the brain sits right there in the skull. We don't think about it much, but this little 3-pound piece of meat there uses 20% of your energy every day. So 3 pounds of your body uses up 1/5 of your energy, and that's because this is what the center of where being human resides. When I was in medical school, I did a fellowship in cardiology, thinking that the human heart was what I wanted to study, and so I used to look in the chest. And I realized later that that's really not where the human heart is, and so I ended up here in the skull. And we're going to talk a bit about that today. The brain is made up, every brain is made up of about 300 billion neurons, each of which makes between 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 connections. These connections form or do not form depending on what experiences you've had or not had. So your brain, the structure of your brain depends on what kind of life you're living, what kind of experiences you have, what kind of things you consciously cultivate, and what kind of things you avoid. So these little connections, synaptic connections is what they're called, are the infrastructure. Now the brain has 3 major parts. It has the front part, which is here is in beige, is the frontal cortex. That's the mind. That's what we think with. That's what we reason with. That's what we do mathematics with. That's what we do music with. That's what we do reading, so on and so forth. That's the most human part of the brain. In the middle part of the brain is something called the limbic system, which is really where the heart of the matter is, although the connections between the limbic system and the heart are extraordinary. Those of you who have had a heartache know that it literally hurts in the chest. So the signals may be coming from the brain, but the pain is in the chest. But the heart, for our purposes today, is the limbic system, this middle part here that's in the aqua. And in the back we have the automatic functions of the brain stem. Those take care of the automatic things like digestion and body temperature and sleep-wake cycles and things like that. That's the body. So if we slice the brain down the middle like this, you can see over here in the light purple is the frontal cortex. Just bear with me. We're going to get somewhere else. In the middle is the limbic system, the emotional center of the brain, the heart of the brain, or of the tonal, of the person, and then some of the automatic functions. So the thing that's interesting here is that this maps directly on to the Mesoamerican concept of the tonal, that we each have a heart, we each have a mind, we have a body, and we should have a purpose or a soul, something bigger than ourselves that we care about. For the purposes of practical use of this tool, we color code the heart as red. It's easy to remember because of the blood. We color code the mind as green, thinking of a green and creative field, fertile field. The body is blue, that's our genetics. And in some cases, we can use that same blue line to map legal connections, who we're married to, etc. And then the soul is outlined in yellow, and we can remember that by light. And I'm not going to go into a great amount of detail today about that. I just want you to understand that this maps directly onto modern neuroscience, even though it's thousands of years old. We don't have a word in English for these four as a unity. And what happened at the turn of the last century was that Freud, brilliant man, and the European psychologists basically were very, very anti-religion, anti-spirit. They thought it was an infantile drive looking for a father figure. So we took the soul out of American psychology and psychiatry. We took much of the heart out as well, and now it's time that we put it back in. And that's starting to happen. We're starting to study happiness. We're starting to study positive aspects. We've only looked at disease and pathology. We've never looked at what health looks like. And that's part of what I'm here to talk to you about today. It's what a healthy human looks like and what their life looks like. And how whatever state you're at, you can move to another level. And I hope that some of what I have to say today is going to help you with that, not only in your work life, but in your personal life and in your relationships. So this is basically, you're familiar with the family genogram, and this is mapped. You see how Bart is connected to his mother and father biologically and his sisters. And then we know that we can map, in this case, this is a 36-year-old divorced mother of a 15-year-old son, and we can see her heart, mind, body, and soul connections to the different people in her life. Like I said, I'm not going to drill down on this today. So, moving on, we're going to talk about the foundations of attunement. We have talked enormously about attachment in our psychologies, but we have spent inadequate time on the concept of attunement. Attachment is a unidirectional phenomenon. Attachment oftentimes can be based on anxiety or insecurity or fear. Attunement is something very different, and let me describe it to you. It's a deep and genuine connection with another human. And the archetype of this is the relationship of a mother to her infant, or a father. Now this relationship, if you think about it, this is one of the most powerful and reliable forces in all of nature. It's as reliable as gravity, just about. We don't think about it as a force of nature in the same way physicists think of laws, but it is a law. It takes a lot to derange this particular drive, the love of a mother for her child or a father for their child. It takes an enormous amount of things going wrong. So this attunement, we see here in this picture of a mother and her baby. They're dancing, their eyes are connected. Their brains are actually connected, as are their hearts and their souls, and they're also their minds. This baby is learning a huge amount in an extraordinarily short period of time. through the facial expressions and the responsiveness of the mother, the baby responds and knows, and the mother responds back and forth. And all of you that are parents know this. Now this back and forth like this, the child's learning about the world, learning about whether the world is responsive, whether or not the world is safe, whether or not the world is something that can be relied on, learning about facial expression. The brain is forming connections at the rate of 1,000 per second at this stage of development. So if anybody thinks a baby can get too much attention, they're wrong. Now, how does this apply in the workplace? Well, one of the ways it applies is whether or not we're trying to tell whether or not someone's sincere or not, for example. And we use clues. How many of you have ever heard of the show Lie to Me? Okay, that show is based on some of the scientific work that was done, some of it, by the way, some of the best of it, done in San Francisco, on facial expression, which is universal around the world. And what we know is that, for example, we're going to use the example of smiling in this case. Which of these smiles is genuine? The one on the left or the one on the right? The one on the left, of course. That's called a Duchenne smile. And we know it's genuine, although a computer could not tell us that it was genuine. No amount of sophisticated software can tell us that it's a genuine smile from another one. We can tell almost instantaneously. We can tell by the little crinkles in the eyes and the little dimples, etc. This is just one example. Now, the child learns to do this by, and we learn to do this from experience. We learn the capacity. Our brains learn to be able to discern facial expression. And you can train this, and the FBI and the CIA and Homeland Security and all these guys are taking courses to learn how better to read facial expressions, the micro expressions, etc. But all of this is laid down in childhood, but it can continue into adulthood. And that's part of the biggest message I have to say, part of the biggest part of the message I have, which is that your brain is plastic. In other words, it can still grow. So I'm going to be talking about some big word, neurogenesis, which all that means is grow new brain cells. And neuroplasticity, which just means you can form new connections depending on your experience. Is this smile genuine? Of course, it is genuine. And this may be why this gentleman, George Clooney, maybe one of the reasons anyway, why he's so successful. Because there is kind of a genuineness in his interactions. These are the scientific slides on which that is based. Duchenne smile versus the Pan American smile. Pan American smile was named after the stewardess for Pan American Airlines. I'm not joking. You can't make this stuff up. Okay, so now we're going to move now directly to the mind, because that's really what we're interested in, and we're going to talk about trying to change our way of being, change our way of living. And as a practical matter, what that comes down to is trying to change certain behaviors, change certain habits, especially habits of mind, by the way. And there are different ways to create metaphors for this, but the best one that I've found is quite ancient, and also it's been used throughout the years for the last 2,500 or 3,000 years, and that's of an elephant and its rider. And let me give you a picture. Okay, there's an elephant and the rider. And basically, we have our conscious mind, the mind that we think with. That's the one that makes New Year's resolutions. That's the one that says, oh, I'm going to lose 40 pounds, or I'm going to go to the gym every day, or I'm going to do this or that or whatever. That's the one that tells us what we're going to do or what we should do. That's the rider. But then we have the elephant, which is the rest of the mind. That's the preconscious mind, which is that part of the mind which you can access if you try, and then the unconscious mind, which you can't get to except in dreams and in other specialized techniques. But for all practical purposes, it's roughly like a rider and an elephant. So now, everything's just fine if the heart and the mind are pointed in the same direction. If the elephant and the rider, okay, the rider being the mind, the conscious part of the mind, and the elephant being the rest of the tonal, as long as they're pointing in the same direction, everything's just ducky. But let's say the elephant decides, well, you know, there's a nice fresh stream of water over there, and, you know, maybe there's some nice grass or whatever, and the rider wants to go and keep going into town or whatever. Guess which way they're going to go? They're going to the stream, correct? Unless you train that elephant. And so training that elephant or learning to master your elephant, your mind, as opposed to being mastered by it, is a lot of what this talk is about today. Now, one of the things that's quite clear, and we know this from data and experience, is that contrary to popular belief, it's much easier to change your way of thinking by changing your behavior than the other way around. So if you behave in a different way, then your thinking will follow. Most people do it the opposite direction. If you stop smoking, for example, just as an example, after a certain point, you're going to conceive of yourself as a non-smoker. Okay? It's the stopping smoking that comes first, actually. And then later, your mind changes and you go, oh, well, yeah, no, I don't smoke because I'm a non-smoker. That's an example. So it's much easier to behave your way into a new way of thinking than to think your way into a new way of behaving. Critical point. And here's another critical point. Nothing is difficult once you are used to it. And this sounds so obvious, but I can't tell you how important it is to understand that once you're used to something, it ceases to be difficult. So maybe the first week of going to the gym, or the first 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks are difficult or whatever, but after it's become a habit, once it's routine, it's no longer difficult. So nothing is difficult once you're used to it. Now, we're going to switch a bit from a little preview of the mind to the heart. And we're going to talk about empathy first, and a bit about compassion. Empathy is seeing the world through the eyes of another. And this is how I learned what it was. I was pretty impoverished as a student, but I liked to hitchhike. Considered myself something of an expert hitchhiker. I've hitchhiked across the United States a few times and across the Andes a couple of times. But I was outside of Denver. And when you're hitchhiking cross country, you want to make sure you get a long ride, and you also want to make sure that you don't get in the wrong car. And so I'm there on the freeway. Back then you could do that. And well, it was kind of illegal. No one would arrest you for it. And this black cougar, the car, pulls up in front of me, and so I run up ahead to it and look through the window, because you get some real weirdos sometimes hitchhiking. Checking to see, is the guy on speed, is the guy drunk, the kind of, or worse, the kinds of things you get, kind of folks you can get picked up. People are usually afraid of hitchhikers. They haven't hitchhiked. A lot of times it's the other way around. At any rate, there was a man in there, maybe his 40s, and the car looked pretty neat, pretty clean, and he looked sober, and I asked him how far he was going, and he said he was going to Vegas. And so I got in the car with him. And he may have looked at me maybe 3 seconds when I got in, or total, and then we were just in the car together. Silence, except for some soft Merle Haggard on the 8-track. And the car was so thick with sadness that you could cut it with a knife. It was amazing. And I sat there with this man for an hour in silence, listening to soft, soft music in the background, over and over. Didn't say a word. After about an hour, he said, without looking at me, he said, "My wife left me." I said, "Ouch." And there was silence. About 20 minutes later, he says, "Have you ever loved a woman who didn't love you back?" And I said, "Yep. It hurts." In silence. Another 30 minutes or something like that. He said, or I said, I don't remember, you can't make somebody love you. And he said, or I said, I can't remember. Nope, you can't make somebody love you. And we drove on to Las Vegas. It was at nighttime. The city was just shining with all these lights, etc. He drove me to the other side of town. It turned out that he was a potato farmer. Not only was he a potato farmer, he owned the potato franchise for McDonald's back then. So the guy was really, really well off. But he was really, really, really heartbroken. And he took me to the other side of Vegas to drop me off, rather than dropping me on this side, because it's much easier to get a ride on the other side. And he said, thank you, as I was getting out of the car. And I said, thank you. I mean, you're the one who gave me the ride. And he said, thank you for being there. And what I realized was that those hours of looking through that windshield together, looking at that desert landscape together, pointed in the same direction, just being there, not interrogating, not doing this or that, just being there and being with, and seeing the world through the eyes of another. That's what empathy was. And all of those years of training at Harvard and this and that, and all the books and this and that and so on and so forth, didn't teach me 1/10 of what this potato farmer taught me about what empathy really is. And so I'm very grateful to him. To this day, very, very grateful. So that's empathy. Compassion is different. Compassion is suffering with the other. It's not pity. It's not feeling sorry for. Compassion is suffering with. There are now, this is a question that's been alive for 3,000 years at least. Is man fundamentally good or evil? We now know about something called mirror neurons, these neurons in the brain that literally mirror the actions or feelings of someone else if we're connected and paying attention. We can show, for example, that if I show you a picture of a man with a broken leg, you will wince seeing that leg broken, right? Because you are wired biologically to empathize and to feel what others feel. So if we get out of our own way, we can attune much, much more with the world. And this not only makes us better at work, better at home, but it makes us happier. And you're going to see that. This is extraordinary.
On the New York City subway, it's hard enough finding someone who will give up his seat to a stranger, let alone be willing to give up his life for one.
The train was coming in like that.
It happened just 50-year-old Wesley Autry, a construction worker and Navy veteran, was standing on a subway platform with his two little girls when right in front of them, a man started having a seizure.
He kind of stumbled and over his own feet and fall backwards. I see a train coming, but the train is so close, I'm like, what do I do?
Wesley jumped onto the tracks and thought if he could just lie on top of the man, keep him from flailing, maybe the train would roll right over both of them. The clearance was exactly 21 inches. Wesley and the man, 20 and a half.
No way the train can stop before this gentleman could get him up off the tracks. So he covered him with his body and pushed him down to a point where the train wouldn't hit his head and held him down under the tracks while the train came and rolled right over the top of him.
It gave Wesley's children the scare of their young lives.
I thought he was going to get killed.
And Wesley, the scare of his, too.
I'm like talking to him, sir, you can't move. I got two kids up here looking for their father to come back. I don't know you, you don't know me, but listen, don't panic. You know, I'm here to save you.
As for the guy Wesley saved, he's 20-year-old Cameron Hollipter. And other than a few scrapes and bruises, his father says he's doing fine.
Mr. Autry's instinctive and unselfish act saved our son's life.
You know, the word hero gets thrown around a lot nowadays.
What a better way to say to start off the new year than to save a life. Hero man.
Nice to be reminded of what one really looks like. Steve Hartman, CBS News, New York.
So now we're going to move to happiness and joy and what we know from the scientific literature and how it applies to work and business. Because this is not just Pollyanna. This stuff, in America, people are interested in the bottom line. So this relates to the bottom line. Let me show you how. But before we get there, there is a philosophical underpinning to this. Aristotle believed that the purpose of human life was happiness. Happiness is the meaning and purpose of life, the whole aim and end of human existence. This was Aristotle. Now, Aristotle was not an Illuminate. And I think that Socrates would disagree with him on this. And I think Jesus would disagree. And I think Plato would disagree. And some other people might disagree with this. That's not to say happiness is not important. But there are things beyond happiness. They won't be the subject of this talk. But it's important. And if you don't believe Aristotle, we can go just to some business books. But before we do that, I want to show you how this maps directly on to the ancient American concept of the tonal, the heart, mind, body, and soul. This is a scientific definition of happiness. Scientifically, happiness is defined currently as the experience of positive emotions, pleasure, combined with deeper feelings of meaning and purpose. That's the definition of happiness by Western scientists currently. And it's a pretty good definition. But notice, experience requires a mind. Positive emotions require a heart. Pleasure requires a body. And purpose requires a soul. And so we can map directly not only onto the brain, but also onto scientific descriptions of happiness